Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Mary Elizabeth Williams. Season 2 of the acclaimed and justly so, The Sex Lives of College Girls is upon us, and that means the return of Kimberly and her friends to Essex. Pauline Chalamet is an actor. She's also a director and a writer. You might know her from King of Staten Island, or maybe as a poll worker in last election. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I am great. I'm the only thing is I'm mad because I only got 6 episodes of the new season. So now I have to be hanging on for a couple of weeks to see how it's
That's
going.
6 more episodes than, or I guess that's 4 more episodes than people are gonna have tomorrow.
I know. So you're killing me a little bit, but I want to get right into it. I want to know more, but I'm glad that I got to see where some of these storylines are going. Because when we left Kimberly last season, she had just lost her scholarship. Talk to me a little bit about where we're going to see her going this season, what her story is, how she's figuring things out moving forward, and who she's evolving into.
Yeah. So Kimberly's left at the end of season 1 with a huge predicament, a predicament that is like so expensive, for lack of a better word. And she's kind of faced to reckon with an issue that many people will have to reckon with later on in life, if at all. But most people have to reckon with some sort of, paying for something that's more than they can afford, or, wanting to do something that just is so exorbitantly expensive, or buying a house or a car, taking out loans, all these adult money things. Kimberly's thrust into that at the age of 18. So when we pick up with Kimberly, we kind of see her start to address this issue, which is her primary predicament of season 2 in the beginning, and kind of figure out ways to come to terms with it and how she's going to be able to do this. What I love about this season is that we really see Kimberly forced to reckon with this problem. And what I mean, an emphasis on the word reckon with it. Like, it's not just like, okay, we have a solution and it's done. Like, she goes home over Thanksgiving and then she comes back and she's like, guys, my parents, they have all this money now, we're fine. It's not a solution like that. It's a character building, growing experience for Kimberly to have to face the fact that she doesn't have the money to continue at school. And so we see Kimberly kind of exploring that. And then we get to also see Kimberly start to feel like she fits in a little more at school. And what does she do with that power? Because that's a really empowering moment where all of a sudden you start to feel like, okay, I was an outsider, but now I'm starting to know the lay of the land. What does that do to someone? And how do you develop in good ways? And how do you develop in maybe questionable ways?
Yeah, I don't think it spoils anything to say that maybe my favorite line of the season that I've seen so far is Kimberly saying, wait a minute, am I the cool one now? And maybe she is, or at least in her own mind, she is. People love Kimberly. We love Kimberly. When you talk to people about this show, there is such deep affection for this character. People root for her, and we root for all of them, but it feels like there is this specialness around Kimberly. What do you think that is about her, about the way she's written, about the way that you are consciously playing her that makes that connection with people?
Yeah, I love that question because I feel that Kimberly grounds the show in a way. Every character has their moments of kind of bringing reality to this 30-minute comedy, right? Like Leighton has another big one of coming out and what the coming out journey is like. But and all the characters do, but I feel that Kimberly's life story, her 18-year life story, has made for very real predicaments to be addressed in a comedic fashion. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to play a character who may be awkward and might be like a little figuring out who she is and how she fits in and all the normal things of college and the ways in which that can be very funny. But I'm on top of that, there's a realness to it. There are dire predicaments which she has to come to terms with, and predicaments that she can't even envision beyond the scholarship, just even as it relates to friends and friendship. What is it like coming from a small town where you did so well and were valedictorian, or whatever the thing is under valedictorian, and you then enter this elite institution where you're going to be surrounded by other people who come from small towns, but you're also going to be surrounded by people who already grew up in these cities where you're light years ahead of your age. And so some of the kind of rules you learn of the world when you grow up, I think in some of these cosmopolitan cities, you learn them when you're in college. And for people who maybe didn't grow up in these places, and I think that Kimberly brings that to the show. You learn very quickly. She's starting to fit in, and what is that? What does that do to her? And I think that's the very relatable experience.
And you are one of those people who grew up in a city. You grew up in Manhattan. You grew up in this artsy family. You have a very accomplished family. You grew up in an environment where you were surrounded by artists and performers and people who were in that world of culture. What was it about this character then that attracted you, that you wanted to play someone who comes from this very different environment where she doesn't have that skill set that New York City kids have from the time they were born? Practically, they're just born with like pistols in their hands, right?
Totally. I think that it's because what attracted me was that this is the majority experience. Like growing up in a New York or in LA or in Chicago or Boston, or that's not the majority experience. The majority experience is living in a suburb of sorts and kind of coming from routines that you understand and know and are quite structured and are less influenced by the place itself. That they're much more influenced by the way you grew up or the school you went to, and that's what really interested me. It's like what happens when someone like this, because Kimberly's college experience, there were many ways I could relate to it, having to work in school, being in a new environment, being around new people, the whole roommate thing, like that I could really understand. But what is it like to come from a world that is so different than my own, not so different from Essex per se, but just so different from but end up in such a similar situation. And that's what really interested me.
You mentioned, you're playing this girl who is 18, who is on, this moment in her life where everything is new, where she's really for the first time having to make these big choices and reckon with it. You are not 18. You play this character so convincingly, but I'm thinking, when you're 18, the idea of even being 30 feels like, oh, a million years from now. When you're playing this character and you're in this world of Essex, do you, as a millennial, young millennial, but millennial, do you notice a generational difference? Do you notice something about the world of 18-year-olds now and the world of Gen Z that seems different than when you were a college student?
I think even more references to the phone, like phones play even bigger role. I mean, I was already on my phone a lot. But I think I had a BlackBerry when I got to college. It was like all about BBMing. So I think the connectedness to phone, definitely the apps, the prevalence of apps in the social scene. DMing, or there's a whole not whole storyline, but there's a whole moment with like a phone and a like and a thing like that was not, I think, as prevalent. Otherwise, things seem pretty similar, I think, because we're staying within the structure of a university.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't feel that foreign to me. But I definitely will say behind the scenes, there's so much to be learned from Aaliyah and Renee, who are these TikTok queens and, showing all the dances and stuff that I think are so fun to do. And And I'm like, this is so cool. But there are so many apps. That's like the big thing, right? All of the apps. There are just too many. Um,
Yeah, it's like there was no TikTok even when you were in college. It's hard to, things change so quickly. It's hard to remember that there was life before that. You know, when you mentioned this foreign environment, I've read that one of the hardest challenges for you playing this role was speaking French with a bad French accent. I want to know how you prepared for that, because obviously you've lived in Paris, you grew up in a French American household. How did you learn to speak French badly, and what did your dad think of that?
um, I actually haven't asked my dad what he thought of that. Maybe that's going to be my first phone call after this interview. Uh, I I feel that really what I did is my mom speaks perfect French, but with a really thick accent. So I kind of grew up knowing what that accent was like. So I just put that on. But it was funny because we had an not an acting coach, an accent coach on set to help the good French speakers. And also Gavin Leatherwood, who was playing Nico, he, is in his character is supposed to be like really good at French in season 1. So she was there to help him. But anyway, during that scene, he wasn't there that day, but she was there to help the people who were supposed to speak good French. And we had crossed paths before, obviously. And then she like came in after a take and was just like, you're speaking too well. Like you're just like putting on an accent, but it's like you wouldn't say the ending of a word like this. You wouldn't say the beginning of a word like this. Like you're not able to pronounce this. And I was like, oh, and then I got really self-conscious about how to speak French with a bad accent, which I thought was going to be super easy.
You never know what's gonna trip you up. I mean, it makes sense, I guess. I want to ask you also about one of the things I think I love best about this show is that universal appeal of a group of women, of a group of girls, and that friendship. You know, we see this motif again and again, obviously in certain classic television shows that I'm not even going to say because we all know who they are. But I also know you're a big film fan. You were just at the Criterion Collection recently. You were a big reader. When you were looking at this story and looking at this show, were there other touchstones culturally that you were thinking about in those dynamics of female friendship?
Well, I mean, the obvious one comes to mind. I mean, for me at least, Girls and Sex in the City, which have these like, but I think what really drew me into this more than the female friendship part, which is a big, this is the backbone of the show, but it was more the like Mindy Kaling universe, the like quick-witted jokes and the situations that the characters were finding themselves in. I remember the first time I read the pilot, there was at least one scene of every character where I was like, oh, I want to play that scene. I want to play that scene. Definitely Kimberly, I was like, okay, this is who I want to play. Absolutely. But I remember reading scenes between Whitney and Dalton and being like, oh, that's a really cool, sexy romance thing. Like that would be really fun to play. And just obviously latent the appeal of like playing the like bitchy New Yorkers. So, make my like Gossip Girl OG dreams come true. And
You're a big OC fan.
Huge OC fan. Huge OC fan. Yes, huge OC fan. Had all of like Mrs. Atwood attire when I was younger and like notebooks and all that. But with Bella, seeing like the comedy stuff, like wanting to be a writer, there were just scenes for each of them that I really loved. And I think that now I totally forgot the question. I'm thinking about the OC.
Well, we can just pivot to make this, an OC fandom conversation, and that would be completely fine. Let me ask you a different question then. You started this show much like people when they're going off to college for the first time really do, which is because of COVID, you didn't know each other. You were just kind of thrown in basically as strangers. now returning to the show, what's different this season now that you have worked as an ensemble together? What feels different about the way that you're gelling as a cast? I mean, the chemistry among you is so tight.
Yeah, I think that we just know each other better. Not only were we, like, all four of us were moving to LA for the show. Um, they had the craziest, I mean, it was normal, it was pre-vaccines, right? So the protocols were super strict. And people were really afraid. You know, it's interesting to look back on those and that like peak COVID time now and be like, oh my God, that was crazy what we were doing. And like all we needed to do is wear masks, but we could hug, we could do this. And if you were tested and you were negative, then you could hang out, you know, but it was like, that wasn't quite how people were thinking. And I think it created barriers, but it made for really interesting first scenes together because we were really discovering each other. Season 2, the protocols were much more lax. You were required to be vaccinated, which was great because it allowed for the protocols to be more lax. And we just understood each other better, knew how we worked. And so our characters were able to meet at that level too.
I want to ask you, now that you are a Californian, as you've mentioned, at least for a while, one of the first things you did was register to vote, set up residency, register to vote, work as a poll worker. I want to know how that came about, why you wanted to do that and participate in the recent election like that.
Yeah, well, I feel that, I work, being in California is new to me. And I've always ever lived in places, New York or Paris, where I already had community. Like I had people. And it's interesting as an adult moving to a city and having to create community. And the world I work in, especially when I'm shooting the show, revolves around the show. It's driving to the Warner Brothers lot every day. It's seeing the same people. It's being in this industry. And I'm very grateful for that. I also really value things that are outside of it. And the things that I've started to learn is that it's very important to be connected to your community, to kind of know where it is you're living and how things work where you're living. And when I got my California driver's license, you could do automatic registration. And I was like, you know what? I've been voting like I'm a New York resident, or was a New York resident. I've been voting in Paris, absentee. And I was like, but now that I'm splitting my time more between California and France, it's important to kind of be in the place where you are. So for me, I was like, you know what? I think working the polls would be a great experience because I'll meet people who have nothing to do with where I work, and I'll get to talk to them and just see it. And also I wanted to know how California voting worked, and I wanted to help the voting process because I do think that we have to pay attention to the state of our democracy. I mean, I'm so lucky to drive and go to work, but because we live in a country where we're able to do so. So I think it's also just, I'm a human being and I'm living in this country, I'm living in this state, and I felt like it was my responsibility. Like we had a civic duty to do so. I was happy to fulfill it. And it was exactly that. I had such a great time. I met some of the loveliest people. I learned a lot. Many of the people worked for the county in all different departments, public health, social services. Someone worked for the district attorney. And especially, California has crazy ballots. I just learned, there were 50 things to vote for. I was like, what is this? New York is not like that. Also, New York has a really outdated voting system. California was so modern, and it was just, so I learned how to vote, and I had really interesting discussions with people who worked for the county, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about how this city functions, this weird city that has other cities in it.
I think I love that you did that, because even though it was millennials and Gen Z who really turned the tide in this recent election, and it was the highest engagement of people 18 to 29 ever, but it was also still only 30%. of
Yeah.
eligible voters, still only 30% of eligible voters in that age group. And I think what you were talking about is a really great example that we need to be engaged, not just also on election day, but
Right,
civic
around, like,
engagement.
know who's on the school board, you know, like who of your district, and who, you know, I'm such a public school advocate, and I've been told, you know, well, you don't have kids, you don't know, like, and it's true. I think that you're put in situations when you're a parent that I don't know, because I'm not a parent, and there are other things to factor in. But the thing that public school gave me is like, you're a part of your community. You're a part of where you're living. And private school, I did 3 years in private school. Private school felt like you were going somewhere. And I just value what public school, outside of the education, which was great, I value what it gave me as a human, as, you know, meeting the friends I met and the relationships I still have to this day, which are the most important in my life, what that was like, being a child in that environment. And for me, that also comes down to volunteering to work at the polls, where it's like, everybody has a job. You should never have a job that excludes you from being a part of society. And that's just something I think about a lot, about just the power that money has, especially in this country and especially in this state, to kind of make you able to look at society as opposed to live in it.
Pauline, I think that's one of the reasons that this show resonates so deeply with people, is because it is a show about friendship, and it's really funny and it's really sexy, but it's also about money and class, and education and privilege, all of those things. And it presents them through this lens that is so interesting and engaging and palatable and enjoyable.
Yeah.
Right? Well, I just want to thank you so much. The new season of The Sex Lives of College Girls is out now. We are so thrilled to welcome you. We love talking to you. Please, Pauline, come back anytime you're also a musician, you're a writer, you've got a bunch, you're a director, you got so many things coming on. So please, just anytime you got anything.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you.
Love to talk to you, and public schools rock.
Public schools rock.
Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure.
Thanks.